So our topic today is how Arizona's unique urban laboratory puts sustainability on the map. So as you all know, sustainability is, you could call it a hot topic. I mean, maybe some people want to call it a trend, but it's not really a trend. It's what we're going to do if we're going to figure out how to continue living on this earth. And I'm sure I don't need to tell anybody who's in our audience today that that's a critically important issue today, but it isn't a brand new issue. It's been with us for a while. So if you can, and for some of you, maybe you're too young to do this, but take yourself back to 50 years ago. Take yourself back to 1970. Specifically, I'd like you to think about May 1970. For those who remember, or for those who know the history, it was a tragic month as students protesting at Kent State University. 4 of them lost their lives to the National Guard. And this was in a moment when, not unlike this fall of 50 years later, students and people were motivated and activated to change the world. It was that same month that the first Earth Day took place, as students marched all over the country to say, we have got to do something to take care of the environmental issues that are threatening us all. And so this was one way that people got very active and did something, but there was another way that some people chose to take action, and it was taking place far away from many of those marches, way out in the at that time, especially the middle of nowhere in the desert in Arizona. Something was happening, and it was drawing students from all over, and young people and people of all ages, frankly, from all over the country, and in fact, really all over the world. It was kind of part of a back to the land ethic that was developing, but most importantly, it was drawing people who really were concerned about what was happening, and they wanted to change the world. And they were drawn to this place and drawn to this man, a big thinker, a visionary, an architect named Paolo Soleri. And Soleri was imagining a different way of living our lives, a different way of thinking about sustainability, a different way of creating cities, really bringing us back to the pueblos that were built centuries ago on this very land where he was drawing people to in the middle of Arizona. And over the next 50 years, more than 8,000 people were drawn to Soleri and to this place called Arcosanti. 50 years later, Arcosanti is still a place that draws people from all over the country and all over the world who are thinking about big ideas and how they can change the world. And today at Arcosanti, we're finding new and creative ways of looking at and thinking about those big ideas. Our virtual reality efforts now are phenomenal, and actually taking those ideas that were on drawings that Soleri made many years ago and putting them literally in front of you through goggles. And so today, Arcosanti is still a place where we bring together people with big ideas, and we want to put those ideas into the context of this whole series of living with the land, because really that's part of the story at Arcosanti, is how do we live in a harsh desert environment? How do we live in communities that are equitable and just and promote the best of us and human beings together? And that's what we're going to talk about with our panel today. We are very fortunate to have 3 people participating with us today who are among those 8,000 that have spent a considerable amount of time at Arcosanti throughout the years. So I'm going to briefly tell you who each of them are with a sort of biography, and then I'm going to ask each of them to say more. I'll sort of have a prompting question for each of them to say more about themselves. So our 3 participants today are Marietta Strano, who arrived at Arcosanti in the 1970s, spent quite a bit of time there. In fact, she still does. She still volunteers for us. She is a teacher. She has taught arts to gifted students. She's teaching English abroad all over the world, even today. She's an active community volunteer, not just for us, but for other causes. And she stayed in Arizona. She came from back east, but she stayed in Arizona and lives in Scottsdale today. So you'll meet Marietta in just a moment. Also joining us today is Kevin Shaffer. Now, Kevin has the great privilege today of being one of those that was there that very first year. He lives in Boston, runs an architectural design consultancy that does all kinds of interesting projects. Just a couple I mentioned on the slide here. We could talk about others, but the Boca Raton Resort, the UFO Museum in Roswell, New Mexico, and there's many, many others. But Kevin's going to tell us about some really intriguing projects that he's working on today that actually are inspired by Arcosanti. And then finally, Ana Vasquez. Ana did her first few months in her workshop at Arcosanti in 2018. She has studied architecture and philosophy, and then she came back. So she's actually living at Arcosanti now. And she's started out volunteering in landscaping, which she still does, but she's also one of our tour ambassadors. So when you send people to Arcosanti today and somebody takes the tour, Ana might be your tour guide. So the picture here is actually the cafe at Arcosanti. And I want you to imagine that you're sitting with us in the cafe. I picked a cafe in particular because it's really a space at Arcosanti where the mix of people and ideas from all over, on the best days at Arcosanti when we have a lot of people from all over, some there for the day, some there doing a workshop for the week, some who might be doing an internship over several months, as well as our permanent residents. There's about 80 people that live at Arcosanti today. This is where you'll find them mixing, and the ideas are mixing. And my hope is our conversation today that begins with our panel sharing their experiences will lead to more mixing of ideas with all of you when we get to the question and answer session later. So actually, I'm going to begin with Kevin. Now, I mentioned that Kevin lives in Boston, but as a matter of fact, today he's hanging out in Florida. So welcome from Florida, Kevin. And I'd love you to take us back to 1970 and say, you know, you were wherever you were then. Tell us where that was. And then you went out to the middle of Arizona to hang out with this guy named Paolo Soleri. What inspired you?
Well, first of all, thank you, Patrick and Norman, for having me. This is a lot of fun. I was a freshman at Syracuse University School of Architecture, and we heard about this Paolo Soleri. He was giving a lecture near Albany, and we drove there in the middle of a storm, snowstorm, I might add, and he showed all these models, and we were just blown away. And I walked up to him and said, well, how do I get involved? He said, well, just come on out. So I talked my parents, who were paying the ticket at that point, into letting me go out there. And so I arrived not really knowing what I would find, and it lived up to expectations. It was a very unusual setting, and whatever you saw on that screen was not there when I was there. We started with shoveling dirt and creating foundations for a couple of the first walls that went on the main apse there. And we literally were out in the middle of nowhere at that point with all the vermin and everything else. But it was just fascinating. A lot of hard work. I lost a lot of weight that summer and time forward. And every morning we'd go up, not every morning, once a week we'd go up to Paolo and we'd sit on a butte a ways away and just ask him questions and just go back and forth with him and tell him the progress we made that day and that week. And it was fascinating. I just said to Patrick, I don't believe I understood everything he was saying because he was a very deep-rooted person philosophically, but it was absolutely fascinating. So that's where I started a bunch of stuff, and we'll get into that a little later. So.
Yeah, we are. We're gonna talk about how sort of what the experience in that sort of unique land was like, and how it relates to many of the things we talk about today with sustainability. So more to come. So Marietta, you were also one of the early, not quite as early as Kevin, but one of the early arrivals. And I know when we talked the other day, you were especially drawn to the sort of the social aspect, like you call it the sociology, if you will, of Arcosanti. Tell us a little bit about, your experience at arriving there in the 70s.
Well, similar to Kevin, and I believe Anna mentioned it earlier when we talked, that what we expected or when we got there, we were not really sure what we were going to encounter. So I arrived there in 73. My intention was just to do one workshop, women in construction. I mean, 1973, what did I know about construction? I did home projects. I was really good at finding things in the trash and making them into something. And it just sparked an interest. And I was just bloody curious of getting out to Arcosanti, the desert. I had no idea how vast it would be in terms of the land. Coming from Philadelphia and popping myself, getting off Greyhound and arriving at Arcosanti. So the amazing part was learning about that land and Arcosanti. So I had all that going on. And I thought one workshop and I'm going to be filled up and I can go home with this. But then I came back and did 2 more workshops and then was asked to stay. And then once you stay, you become a resident, you're paid, and there's a whole process. There was a whole process to that, just like now, the whole process. I had such it informed me. The people who lived there, those in charge, or those who were just coming from all over the world, I felt like my world, my breadth of knowledge just opened up being at Arcosanti. The land, the people. So I guess I would say my investment paid off. I didn't know what I was getting into, and it gave me a lot in return. I hadn't been away at college, never. I paid for my own college piecemeal for many years to get through into a master's degree. And here I was in dorm settings that I had not experienced, where many people who were there had been away to college. And I just felt like I was rising up. Yeah, it was fantastic. Yeah.
Well, it sounds like it had a huge impact on you. I want to ask all of you later about sort of how it continued to influence your life as you went on. But tell us a little bit about what is it about the way Arcosanti is designed. Like when you arrived there were some buildings already. They were obviously still building, but and there was more to come. But what was it about the way the place was designed that influenced? I mean, apart from just the dorms, what else about Arcosanti had that impact on you?
Yeah, and I mean, they're really not called dorms, but since I hadn't had that dorm experience, I think it was that access that I could be. I'm an urban person. I'm from Philly, I could be clustered in a community, be extroverted or introverted, and then within minutes, the access to the land that I knew nothing about. I knew nothing about that part of Arizona. And I think that's something that really made me return, to know that I was not, I wanted to experience rural life, yet I didn't want to go be a farm girl. And there I was at Arcosanti within a community, learning about, we didn't use the word sustainable then. It wasn't a popular term, but being frugal, being wise with resources, things that I have already experienced in my own life, but this was more of an expansion of that. So I'm very well informed. Yeah.
And Kevin, what about you? What now when you were there? Now tell us a little. I know when we talked before, you may be the first official resident of Arcosanti. Is that right?
That's what I claim to be.
What a privilege.
Paolo, I don't think Paolo agreed with that, but when we got the first foundation built and we put a wall up there, up to that point, it's just dirt everywhere. And I got it in my head that and at night it was just spectacular out there. As Marietta said, it's just unbelievable. So I got it in my head that I would go up and just camp out on the foundation up there. And so I went up, and the stray cat that was in the dorms down below came up with me. And so there I stayed for the rest of my time. Eventually, some other folks came up, and so we started to hang out as a group up there. But it was a little scary the first night up there alone, I'll tell you. Little weird up there. But yes, that is my claim, one of my claim to fame. But you asked an interesting question of what my first reaction was when I got to Cosanti, the headquarters in there. And I got there at dusk, and it was very odd. And the buildings are like nothing you've seen anywhere at that stage of the game. And it was like very, like the earth had come up out of the ground in some fashion and decided to build something there. And when I first saw Star Wars and Luke was in his farm down below there, I suddenly realized that's what it felt like in there, like out in the middle of some desert planet and this stuff going on. So it was really, I hadn't found the words until I saw that movie, and that's it, that's the thing there. But it was fascinating.
By the way, on the Star Wars note, you'll notice behind Marietta are some of the bells, the world-renowned bells that are still made by Cosanti Originals, a subsidiary of the foundation which runs Arcosanti. I am told there is a scene in that movie, elsewhere in the movie, where you'll actually see a couple of our bells in one of the scenes. Somebody did a freeze frame. Apparently, it's real. So anyway, I don't know if there really are bells. They certainly look like it. So both of you are still, in the Arcosanti world, we call you alumni. So once you've spent some time, as you both did many years ago, you are forever an alumnus of Arcosanti. And Mariette, I'll come back to you. Tell us a little bit about how your experience there has continued to influence your life. And I know when I first met you a couple of years ago, I was intrigued by the way you live in Scottsdale, which is a little different than a lot of other people do in Scottsdale.
Oh, yeah.
So, how has it influenced your life throughout these 50 years?
Well, I think it's reinforced commitment of sticking with what you believe, your values. I live in Scottsdale. I'm a senior. I live in Scottsdale without a car. And when I came back from overseas, I was determined to find the right fit. Went back to Philly to see if maybe I would return to my roots. And I had connections here, Arcosanti and friends. And the idea of, this is nothing like Arcosanti or the theoretical ideas of Arcosanti, but that I could live here and not have a car. And it challenged me. And I wanted to stick with that value because I've lived without a car more often in my life than I've had a car. Even growing up, my family never drove. We never had a car until much later in as the 70s and the late 60s. So that car, the lack of a car is a big deal for me. Because, with Uber now, you have a certain percentage of more cars on the street because of Uber. And even though people are pleased to just call Uber and dash off to wherever they have to dash off, it hasn't decreased cars on the roadways. So I'm a big proponent of no cars as much as we can within the urban environment. And that was really reinforced being at Arcosanti.
Well,
even though we're rural.
And it's got to be an impressive thing that somebody can live in one of the more car-centric places, the Metro Phoenix area, without a car. I do know one other person who does that. I met a few years ago that went to Arizona State University, came from Seattle, Washington, and then stayed living here. I think he's lived here more than a decade at least now. And he still has, from the day he arrived at the university, still to today, never got a car. Don't know how he does it, but he pulls it off. It can be done. So,
well, it's a challenge because this summer with the heat, the continual the heat was awful this summer in Arizona, and with the virus having to be sequestered, not taking public transportation because of the virus, I had to really micromanage myself of going out and about and getting home before 10 o'clock. We're getting out of the sun before 10 o'clock in the morning. So yeah, it's a challenge. It's much better now. The weather has changed, still kind of quasi-sequestered. Yeah, it's a challenge and I love it. Knock on wood, as long as I can do it, I'll do it.
But it sounds like your first notion you could do it started at Arcosanti. So for Kevin now, similar question, but in your case, you're an architect and and have spent many years working on very interesting projects. Tell us how, especially in your work as an architect, what you learned and experience at Arcosanti influenced your work.
Well, I should first point out that my father was an architect, and he encouraged my going to Arcosanti, which surprised everybody, including my mother. And it turns out that he had gone out to work with Frank Lloyd Wright and met with him in Taliesin and said, what an awful person. and decided right then and there that wasn't for him. So it was his way maybe of getting back at Frank. But anyway, so I was very fortunate as to have him guiding me through all these years. I think that arcology and everything I learned out there is part of a broad spectrum of projects that I get involved with. I do hospitality work primarily, but I like the broader range of subjects and different design venues. And arcology, Arcosanti, all of that experience gave a whole new spectrum of things that I was doing. And ironically, after I had graduated from college, I went to work for I.M. Pei and Partners in New York. And he was fascinated with Paolo Soleri. In fact, they made me give a in-show lecture there on everything that we did at Arcosanti. So I found it quite interesting. I was working on a very large project in Singapore, and that suddenly I'm working on this large thing, and then there was this other thing at Arcosanti, and I'm like, it was a very interesting twist of how all these things came into being. So I think it broadened my focus. It broadened my notion of what architecture could be, and went for it with a vengeance in some projects that are philosophical at this point. But I thought it was a bold idea, and so I've tried to go forward in many respects, looking for those bold ideas that can be promoted.
Well, and we'll talk in a moment about, more about that. I do want to take just a quick moment to remind our audience that we will have a question and answer so that you can ask your probing questions of all of our Arcosanti alumni. And you can do that by entering your questions in the chat. If you move your mouse to the lower part of your screen, you'll see the chat feature. And what we would ask you to do is start putting your questions there. You can either ask a question to the entire panel, or you can pose a question to one of the particular panelists. Norm Pratt will be tracking those, and when we get to the question and answer session, he'll be our Q&A moderator and take those questions. So be sure that as you're hearing this discussion and you have questions, start typing those into the chat, and Norm will track those. Also, for those who are wondering, Ana Vasquez, I think we're having some technical issues, so we're hoping to get her on as soon as possible. I know that it'll be especially exciting for you to hear about somebody who just showed up at Arcosanti a couple of years ago and is living there now, and relate what was going on years ago with what's going on today and how that moves into the future. So hopefully we can get Anna on here real soon. So you just mentioned the Frank Lloyd Wright School of Architecture, Kevin, a moment ago. As a matter of fact, news this year in 2020 is that the students from the School of Architecture, founded by Frank Lloyd Wright, are actually studying now at Arcosanti. They started this summer and they are there this fall, and we're hoping we're going to have programming for them both at Arcosanti and at Cosanti in Paradise Valley in 2021. So we have this wonderful new collaboration that really has an interesting historical legacy that obviously is very relevant to you personally, but obviously to many people who know the story of Paolo Soleri and his arrival in Arizona. So let's talk more about this sort of idea, the notion of the ideas, you know, that this was this place in the desert. You know, for some, it's a way to get away from what are seen as the problems, maybe, whether it's in the big urban areas or just in society at large, and work on them and think about them. And but the importance of it is not just to think about them, but then to translate it into action and doing something about them. Marietta, maybe you can talk a little bit about what are the ideas that made sense to you that you then, basically took into the world beyond Arcosanti after your original years there?
Yeah, I think it gave me confidence. I was a young girl then, confidence to do things at a grassroots level, and to be active in my community. As I saw the community at Arcosanti embracing me, and all the people who came there to educate each other and what they had to offer, I think bringing that out and about in all the communities I've lived in, even when I lived overseas, I've talked about Arcosanti to people there. So I think it's that grassroots feeling, yeah.
And what about the particular experience of being in this, really different climate, about, the lessons you learned in living in a desert environment, very different than where you had grown up, and how those lessons translate into relating to other people thinking about the environment?
Ooh, that's a big question. Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I participate in any of the workshops that are offered to keep educating myself so I can pass that on. And the community I live in now, which is a senior community, and being able to discuss future plans of the resources that we're using and what we're using right now with our resources. I'm not sure if that directly relates to how you're asking me that question. So go ahead, pick at it more for me. Yeah.
No, that's a good start. Well, I'll shift to Kevin a little bit. Sort of, how do you see the ideas around integrating the way we build our built environment with the environment? How do those ideas, Kevin, translate into how you communicate with people?
Well, at this point, as we chatted earlier last week, the one avenue that I have taken in great interest in is floating architecture. And part of that is looking at the growth rates of the world and the pressure that is putting on all of our urban centers on the coast. So about 10 years ago, I got involved with a couple of projects which basically were looking at a mile-long ship that held 50,000 people that would go around the world and tour the world. And I looked at this picture, I wasn't going to do anything about it, and suddenly I said, I'm hooked. Because it was the same boldness that Paolo and his ideas were spreading in the world. So I've taken that to heart and have gotten this notion of there's a huge future on our coastlines. I know it's not the land, but land and water are one and the same. And so from that point of view, I'm working on 2 or 3 projects that are actually, we'll see if they get done in the current way that the world is turning, that will actually begin to hone in on our urban environments, coastal urban environments that are going to be under a lot of stress, unfortunately, in the next 50 years. And part of that was I presented a couple of mega scale projects that, one for New Orleans, which was a 120-story triangle that was going to house 50,000 people. And that was the beginning of how I got hooked into this notion of how do you wed the mega projects and the sustainable aspects of that and blend that into how people actually live and work together in a water environment, which is ultimately going to be back and forth on land no matter what. So that's sort of where I'm going.
So, and these are projects you're currently working on right now? I mean, they're being conceived and you're developing?
Well, the 3 that I mentioned were very much in the Soleri vein. They are mega projects, and I took a lot of grief from a lot of colleagues by promoting those. It got a lot of press, which shocked me to no end. But the one that is really the most that's moving forward is called Harvest City in Haiti. And from that, it's looking at, this was right after the earthquake there, looking at how does that community come back, basically an agricultural community. So myself and some colleagues came up with this notion of building a floating agricultural community that could house 50,000, 20,000 people. And so that has gotten a lot of interest. We've had some interest from the government, several governments there. It's a long ways off, but it's about a 2-mile diameter building, series of buildings, each one dedicated to different types of planting, all sustainable with all the windmills, solar panels, everything. So it's self-sufficient as an entity in Prince-Port Harbor. And the notion there was to give relief to the land and let that restore itself, and then begin to build this as a means of employing people that can then do both water-based land, agriculture, and land itself. So that one is moving forward to a degree.
Wow, that sounds fascinating. And when we talked about this the other day, we were discussing the notion that while it seems like the idea of a floating city, which is dealing with water, right? Because that's going to become the issue for so many of these coastal locations, seems so radically different than a desert like we're in Arcosanti, where water is decidedly not a thing we have a lot of. And yet at the same time, they're dealing with the same issue, right? They're dealing with resilience and
Correct.
Adaptability,
Correct.
right?
Yep.
So maybe Marietta, that's another way to sort of build on that theme is what's your perspective on the notion of we as people being adaptable and resilient no matter what kind of harsh climate experience we're facing?
Wow. Well, you come from an educator's background. And when I think about that, I think about how to educate the public, which is here in Arizona with water use. That's always been difficult. Not even being not a native person from Arizona, my understanding is when I talk to people who grew up here, it's been the same topic for a lot of years, the water use, a lot of years.
And how do you deal with water use, all these years that you've been living in the desert?
Well, here I am, just one person, and how wonderful it would think about the critical mass, it being built this way. First thing I did when I moved into where I live is I put in the gutter so I could collect my water. So every summer I've had water, except this summer. My barrels are not full, So I have 255 gallons, and I know people here in Scottsdale who are from Arcosanti, also alum, and they also collect water and do things that are what we call sustainable. I would love for this whole community to do it, or for zoning and planners of communities to infringe possibly on those freedoms that we have, to say to builders, you have to show us how you're going to expect the residents of these new buildings that are popping up everywhere, and especially in South Scottsdale, how are we going to do the water? How are we going to reuse it? And so not being in that field of design or urban planning, that's why I go to all these meetings to hear what the problems are and why can't we? And it really has to do with, because we have a right to build the way we're building, which we've done great things. I mean, the better windows, the better materials. But can you imagine? And that's what we have to do. Imagine water use here in Arizona as a theme for builders to consider.
Yeah,
maybe in my lifetime.
Well, I think an argument can be made that while we have a long way to go, we have more lessons to learn. I am certainly aware that Arizona has a pretty good track record, because it's always been, our water deficit has been a feature of the place. For example, our groundwater management has been studied by urban planners around the world, who might be in a place that you would think has more water and shouldn't have a problem, and yet they do anyway. And they come here to learn how to manage their groundwater better, because we've been doing it pretty well for a long time. So that's where I think hopefully what we're learning here in Arizona are lessons that people in all kinds of environments you know, can build from. This is especially important when more and more of the population of the world is living in a desert environment, because more of the world is desertifying, right? Becoming more desert-like. So oddly enough, again, as we talked about the floating cities, Kevin, there are these places that are being inundated with water while other places are becoming more desert-like. But Kevin, if you might also address though, even though in the floating city idea, again, this notion of whether it's water or whether it's agriculture, right? Food, necessary for the population, this notion of how you make it sustainable within that city is still critical. So maybe talk a little bit about how you're addressing that in the floating city.
So I think there are three issues. Number one, I wanted to just get back to Marietta. The technology of today's construction is far different than 50 years ago. And one of the things that has grown proportionately in my professional career is now the attention given to what products are out there that actually work with the environment. Having said that, we're looking at concrete, for example, as these floating platforms. And concrete, as you know, is terrible CO2. It just rids itself totally of CO2 and is a big polluter. So one of the things we're looking at with engineers around the world is there are new technology that encapsulates CO2 in concrete, number one. Secondly, there are new types of reinforcing bars within that are not steel, that are actually part of lava flow, if you can believe that. I didn't believe it at first. So materials that go into all of these things, where you are or in a floating city, those things matter because we're running out of resources and they have to count. I see Anna is back here. And Anna had an interesting point the last time, that the other thing I'm sort of on board with is food is going to be, in addition to water, a huge element. And so one of the things we're looking at is hydroponics. And I think that within each of these quote unquote cities or dwellings that we're looking at would be a very large hydroponic service. And that applies to both the desert and the water itself. And both of those have the ability to use far less water and produce far more. So we're looking at a modular, for example, that's about 100 by 100 feet. As just an example, as a hydroponic farm, that produces as much as 80 acres of lettuce. So when you take that and you make that proportional to the food process that's out there, and then either build it on land or build it in water, that's a technology that's basically around the corner. And the other notion of being on the water is it's very close to where you have to be. So you don't have to drive as far. The food is immediate to the community, which cuts down on all of the trafficking between all of that stuff. So make a long story short, those types of things are a variety of things we're looking at.
Well, and it's fascinating, right? Because those are really, at the heart of it, those are very much the ideas drawn from the same philosophy that Soleri was talking about 50 years ago, and they're just new ways of adapting them to the situations that we find ourselves in 50 years later. And I want to begin pivoting toward now the 50 years later and the future, and looking at where Arcosanti fits into that, which is good that we've got Anna on now. I'm glad we're able to get over our technical issues. Welcome, Anna. Actually, I'll ask you to say a couple of introductory things in a moment, but I want to pivot a little bit, or segue from what Kevin just said. Hydroponics are actually happening at Arcosanti today. And so another example where what we're doing at Arcosanti today, which is built on these ideas from 50 years ago, are also at the cutting edge of what's going to happen in things like floating cities in the future. And this sort of weaves a story of these big ideas and how they inspire us at a place like Arcosanti. So with that, Anna, maybe you can tell us a little bit about, as a current resident and somebody who first arrived a couple of years ago, what you see as exciting at Arcosanti today that will be relevant to the future for you and all of us?
I think one of the most exciting things that's happened since I've arrived actually happened in the middle of our shutdown for the pandemic, when we shifted our focus from, like tourism and a lot of the other things, all of the other aspects that our Cosanti is a part of, back into the community, back into ourselves. And what you saw a lot of was people starting to grow their own gardens. Like we began to realize how important it was to be able to sustain ourselves when all of the other, systems in the world are kind of like shaking up a little bit, and that we have all the resources to do that. Even here in the desert, we have a means to get water, we have land, so we have everything we need to survive. And we saw this huge shift of our attention into that. And that's actually when the agricultural program began growing at the fastest rate that it's grown in the last couple of years. So yeah, I think centralizing all of those like very crucial human needs to survive and being able to get that from here, from the desert, even as harsh of an environment as it is, was really exciting to see.
Yeah, well, it is interesting how sometimes in those hours of need and crisis, we maybe get to something we should have been doing anyway, but right? We get caught up in the systems that we rely on. And that's very much what Soleri was trying to do, right? We get caught up in automobiles because they were given to us, and then we realize they're not necessarily that great. And so how do we wean ourselves from them? And in a crisis, sometimes that's when it happens. So I'm going to ask a couple more questions on it, but before I do, I want to remind our audience that you've got the chat feature at the lower part of your screen. When you move your mouse there, if you're on a computer, you can type into the chat. So if you have questions for our panel, either for the whole panel or for a particular individual, please type those questions in, and just a few moments we'll get to that Q&A session, and Norm will be monitoring those questions. So we look forward to seeing your questions. So Anna, you have an interesting pedigree educationally, where you studied both philosophy and architecture. So I guess it was almost a given you were going to end up at Arcosanti, but tell us a little bit about your journey and how you got to Arcosanti.
So I actually first learned about Arcosanti through looking at Soleri's drawings that are in the arcology book, the big black book that kind of like started this whole thing up. And that was actually a gift from a professor, because at the time I was doing research into communities that were wanting to tackle some of these bigger issues historically. And what was really interesting, and what really drew me to Arcosanti, is that out of all of those theories and the science and experimental cities and utopias and all of that stuff, this was the only built one. This was the only one that attempted to see what life in that system would be like. And of course, that comes with a lot more, with a check of reality that we experience here every single day, especially in this environment, because this specific arcology is in the desert. But yeah, this is how I came to know about Arcosanti and how I came to visit. I wanted to see one of those theoretical ideas and big dreams actually realized in its problems and its exciting aspects as well.
And so what are some of the lessons that you're learning now that, you came first a couple of years ago, and then you came back this year. You've been there for a few months now. I'm trying to remember when you arrived. Yeah. So tell us about what lessons you're learning in that environment today.
Well, the biggest lesson I've learned, it's just in relation to my daily life, is to pay attention to the patterns of the wildlife and kind of mimic those, because you can live a lot more comfortably if you learn from them. For example, here the season changes are very drastic. We get really cold winters and we get really hot summers. And a lot of our architecture is embedded in nature. It's not isolating ourselves from nature. So we get to experience the seasons a lot more strongly than I've ever gotten to experience them before. So learning to adjust like how I function in certain months of the year, but also how I function in certain times of the day. Like my schedule really shifts from the summer to the winter. And yeah, so learning a lot from the life that's been inhabiting this place for a really long time, and like getting into the schedules.
So thinking about the future, Anna, don't know how long you're going to be at Arcosanti, but whether it's your own future or you think about, sort of the broader world that Arcosanti is hoping to influence, what do you see the greatest potential of Arcosanti doing to help shape that future?
So
Yeah, get ready, Kevin and Marietta. You got to answer this.
That's a big one.
it's such a
Marietta,
big
you go
question.
first.
Take it away, Anna.
So I think that being here and people that are able to come spend more than a couple of weeks in the space and like really learn to slow down and apply those patterns that I was talking about into their daily lives, it teaches you a lot of lessons. And I think one of the biggest lessons it teaches you that has the potential for changing a lot of the way that we approach the world today and how we engage with it is that there's a lot of things that we don't need. And it's that refocusing back on the essentials. So for example, you don't need air conditioner all day long to be comfortable. You're able to, like, not having all of those luxuries and all of those extra comforts actually feeds you a lot more, and it makes you see the world in a different way, that you realize that a lot of the things and a lot of the ways in which we live in cities today are not really necessary. We've just grown accustomed to them because we were born into that system where houses look a certain way and cities function a certain way. And when you step away from it, while at first it might be a little bit more uncomfortable and you have to adjust to it, once you adjust, there's actually a lot of value to that. And you realize that there's a lot of things that we do in our daily lives that are not really needed. So refocusing onto what's important and learning to engage
That's
more
fascinating. Yeah. Kevin, Marietta, either one of you want to sort of chime in on kind of where Arcosanti fits in that look into the future?
Yeah, I enjoy hearing from Anna. What it reminds me of is thinking through how we improve the quality of our life by changing our standards. An air conditioner all day grinding out, or does it have to be at a particular temperature to feel comfortable? But the discomfort that you feel at Arcosanti when you come from the privileged life that we have in the United States, and if you show up at Arcosanti, there's some discomfort. But it's temporary. But what it instigates and ignites is that feeling that Anna was talking about, or the knowledge of what you need and don't need, and how that goes, okay, I got to really think about this and reflect on it. Am I just going to return to I wasn't in the suburbs, but let's just use that as an example. Am I going to return to my suburban life and just crank up the air conditioner? Or am I going to make those changes because my temporary discomfort and information and the informing that I got at Arcosanti, how am I going to generalize that? So there's Anna at Arcosanti thinking about that.
Yeah.
And 50 years ago, we all thought about it. Yeah.
It's an interesting thread throughout the years. Kevin?
Well, I'm optimistic, let's put it that way. I think that the next 50 years, we can all doom and gloom about a lot of things, but I think in the end, there are new generations that are coming around, Anna being one of those, that are very encouraging, and I think have in her own words, put together a new set of items that the future will hold. And I think that future is not only by having spokespeople there, but I also think that the necessity of just the economics of where the world is going to push everybody in that direction. I think I know I shouldn't, but I look forward to politics which encourage change. And I think that I look around and so much, we've just gone through it. I'm not going to get into all that, but what's interesting is when you look at the politics of today, they're not encouraging much of anything. So it's going to be up to people like Arcosanti and all of this to sort of put front and center those ideas that then politicians can get hold of. And a lot of that is going to come down to the grassroots of everyday life of here and there. But I think that both the economics and the politics of all of these changes is probably going to happen a lot quicker than we think. Necessity is the mother of invention. And I think that when things, and they seem to be going in a direction that's going to urge everyone very dramatically to get on board with helping our planet. I know it sounds sort of trite, but that day is coming sooner than later, I hope. And I think that we've gone through this phase of what the worst of politics can do. And now we know what that is, and we can get rid of that. And we move forward with hope that we can all begin to go back to the roots. Because in the end, those roots are what Anna said, are how we live with each other here on the planet. And there are going to be more people, and more people are going to create more problems and more resources and everything else. So we're reaching a tipping point. I don't think we're there yet, but we're reaching a tipping point where this is going to turn around on itself. And I think that's my optimism, that at that tipping point, those things that we've all talked about today will find their way to the surface and become the norm. So I remain optimistic. How's that?
Well, that sounds wonderful, Kevin. Actually, that's a wonderful segue, to bring us back to where we started with the presentation at the beginning, right? To those days in 1970 where people were saying, look, there's something out there wrong. There's something that we know can be better. And it was very chaotic time, and it felt like much of what was going on in the mainstream political and social environment was just so disruptive, and people were looking for something better. And really, it's no different today. We've had 50 years of other kinds of learning that happened along the way. And yes, sustainability is a word today that people use. So we've advanced and we're better, but we know we still have some underlying problems to solve. But we want to be hopeful. And what we're, I think, still trying to do at Arcosanti and through the Cosanti Foundation is to connect all of those ideas. The blue urbanism and the floating city that you're working on, Kevin, and these big ideas in the future. The way that you live your life, Marietta, in a very, what people would say is unusual way, in a classic car-centric place like Metro Phoenix. And Anna, in your inspiration to be at Arcosanti and to be looking at what am I learning now that is going to change what I can do going forward as the generation that, quite honestly, you're going to have a lot of this on your shoulders as we go forward. So a very hopeful future, I think, is still what we're all about at Arcosanti, just like it was when it was in the middle of nowhere in 1970.